Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York in Bayside, Queens. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. Today's talk is entitled The Holocaust in Hollywood Studios at Home and Abroad, 1933 to 1941, and features Dr. Stephen Carr, who's professor and graduate program director of communication and director of the Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. He's also the author of Hollywood and Anti-Semitism, A Cultural History Up to World War II. The Kupferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's event is part of the 2024-25 Harriet and Kenneth Kupferberg Holocaust Center and National Endowment for the Humanities Colloquium, Circuitous Exchanges. The event is organized by the KHC and is co-sponsored by the Holocaust, Genocide, and Interfaith Education Center at Manhattan University, the Ray Walpole Institute for the Study of the Holocaust, Genocide, and Crimes Against Humanity at Western Washington University, the Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. After the presentation, please submit your questions via the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And now to kick things off, it's my great pleasure to welcome one of this year's KHC NEH Fellows, Dr. Julia Rothenberg. She's Associate Professor of Sociology here at Queensborough, where she teaches courses in the sociology of the arts, urban sociology, and introduction to sociology. Dr. Rothenberg's published works include Sociology Looks at the Arts, Repurposing the High Line, Aesthetic Experience and Contradiction in West Chelsea with Steve Lang in City, Culture, and Society, Repurposing the Black Arts Movement on the South Side of Chicago in Arts and Power, Policies in and by the Arts, and Teaching Sociology of the Arts at an Urban Community College during the pandemic, Reflections on Structure, Agency, and Community Engagement in Teaching Sociology. Dr. Rothenberg, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Laura. It's my pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for attending. And I would like to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Stephen Carr. Dr. Carr is a professor and graduate program director of communications at the Institute for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Purdue University, Fort Wayne. He's the author of Hollywood and Anti-Semitism, A Cultural History Up to World War II. Some of that material he will be discussing today, and we look forward to hearing him speak and having a lively conversation afterwards. So thank you. I'd like to present Dr. Stephen Carr.
Thank you so much. And it's a real privilege to be here. I also just wanted to thank Dr. Laura Cohen and Dr. Julia Rothenberg for this opportunity and just for their generous assistance, not just for this presentation, but for many other successful collaborations that we've had over the years. So what I wanted to do was, I guess, start by expanding the NEH colloquium theme of circuitous exchanges. And I wanted to ask, what if circuitous exchanges included not just diasporic populations or human flows of slavery and genocide? What if circuitous exchanges included mass culture and mediated texts? Media industries themselves operate as a kind of multi-directional exchange circulating among people, organizations, and texts. When discussing media, scholars typically break down this process into three main parts. So producers, texts, and audiences. Exchanges occur between each of these parts in different ways. Globalized media industries produce many kinds of texts, not just to a single audience, but to many different audiences worldwide. Once these texts reach different audiences, I would argue producers lose control of what these audiences then can do with those texts, including how they interpret them. Audiences behave unpredictably, and producers learn from these behaviors and reactions, hoping to come up with the next big hit. So I think one way to kind of understand this is to think about early film. So early film itself, I would argue, operated as a kind of multi-layered, circuitous exchange that involved people, capital, and texts. Both in the U.S. and abroad, diasporic Jewish immigrants historically barred from other professions were able to easily move into this new industry. No one expected early film to achieve the kind of popularity it did. It quickly moved from a technological novelty to a true mass medium. Because it was so new, Jewish immigrants found easy access at the ground level and easy career mobility up through the business of distributing and exhibiting films. And again, because there really was no precedent for it. And so entry into the business required very little capital. All you needed was an abandoned storefront, some folding chairs, a projector, and a screen. So this is an image from a 1909 theater. These theaters were often called Nickelodeons. This was maybe a little bit of a nicer theater, but really, again, all you needed were, a few folding chairs, some kind of, empty space, etc. But because of film's popularity, the American film industry matured very quickly. So that by the 1920s, there was this kind of circuitous exchange of texts that had become a globalizing force outside the U.S. And the U.S. film industry in particular had begun to achieve a kind of dominance through its worldwide distribution networks. And in this 1925 Saturday Evening Post article, you'll note the title is Trade Follows Film. And, people really took notice of this kind of worldwide appeal of film. U.S. commercial attaché stationed in Berlin, and who's quoted in this article, noted the really phenomenal influence of American film in selling American consumer goods in Germany. So the American film industry also faced a number of pretty intense challenges that resulted from film, operating within this globalized exchange and having its text circulate throughout the world. So one thing was the rise of sound technology in the late 1920s and 30s, which really complicated Hollywood's business, and particularly its globalized export. So sound technology required expensive new technology and rewiring of theaters. I should just also note as a side observation that many Hollywood studios owned their own theaters, so they really had to cover these costs. And for example, Warner Brothers almost went bankrupt because it owned so many theaters and did not expect sound to take off in popularity. So they had to put in a lot of money rewiring and sort of reconfiguring their theaters. So that was one thing. Another challenge that the studios faced was that because sound involved spoken dialogue, Hollywood studios discovered that they had to make multiple language versions of the same film. And again, this was quite expensive for them. And with the advent of sound and also globalized distribution chains, the rise of these multiple language versions of films created some, I guess, intensified resentments abroad in terms of other national cinemas. Um, so the so these national cinemas resisted, tried to resist Hollywood dominance, arguing that the sort of English hegemony was threatening to their cultural identity, and they often used globalization rhetoric. So meanwhile, there was an undercurrent of anti-Semitism that had emerged in the early 1920s that specifically targeted Hollywood as a threat to Christian civilization. And so this was, Henry Ford's infamous Dearborn Independent, which sort of refurbished the anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, and kind of turned it into a series of newspaper articles, which then went on to become the basis for the International Jew. And then in 1936, Pope Pius XI issued an encyclical called Vigilante Cura, which perpetuated this sort of narrative of Catholic decency prevailing over so-called Jewish venality. And in that document, Pius noted that Hollywood's quote producers and its operators were incapable of upholding moral standards and not disposed to stand by the moral principles that they had promised to keep. And at the time, the News Weekly magazine Time smirked then that, and again I'm quoting here, as Pope Pius was well aware, few Hollywood producers are Roman Catholics, except that he controls a spiritual empire of 331 million people, most of whom are cinema addicts. They naturally know very little about the Supreme Pontiff. They meaning the people in Hollywood. So after after an important 1915 Supreme Court case, another challenge that the industry faced were the rise of censorship boards. So censorship boards had popped up locally and at the state level. Film industry had also had to contend with international censorship abroad. Each of these censorship or review boards had their own unique demands, creating a nightmare patchwork of diverse cultural and political standards requiring dozens of different versions of the same film. All this was expensive and cut into studio profit margins. So how did Hollywood respond to these kinds of challenges? Well, in the 1930s, they created something called the Production Code Administration, or PCA. Many of you might know this organization by its other name, the Hays Code. Now, the PCA served as a kind of clearinghouse for what all these various censorship and review boards would most likely censor. And the idea was the PCA existed to streamline costs for studios and increase efficiency, since the idea was to reduce the number of different versions studios had to produce for each jurisdiction where a film was screened. The PCA also provided public relations for the film industry. And again, this is not my idea, but I would argue that this was kind of a masterstroke of regulatory theater on the part of the film industry, since the PCA gave the appearance that an oversight body was getting tough on the film studios, even though the film studios were basically paying for and funding this oversight body. In actuality, the PCA as an office existed within the film industry's trade organization and public relations arm. It's called the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association. And again, the studios created the MPPDA back in the 1920s, in part to respond to and handle public relations crises. So in some ways, you can say this creation of the new office, the Production Code Administration, was really just a kind of an extension of what the studios had been trying to do since the 1920s. And here I would also just argue that from a public relations standpoint, the PCA could existed so that it could appease, I mean, not exclusively, but certainly in part, so that it could appease anti-Semites, since it did give the appearance that Protestant and Catholic values were supposedly bringing an allegedly immoral and profit-driven Jews into line. Okay, so just in terms of framing, what I mentioned before, if you think about circuitous exchanges, then the circuitous exchanges of Hollywood occurred occupationally, through these kinds of cultural flows and through these various battles to assert different kinds of cultural and religious identities. Circuitous exchanges also occurred as a way to try to define and regulate public morality. And they occurred because of the industry's own effort to constantly regulate and standardize its own content and thereby minimize costs and increase its efficiencies. Okay, so because of these circuitous exchanges, then the Hollywood studios found themselves at kind of the front lines of the concerted Nazi campaign, sort of that concerted Nazi campaign of racialized anti-Semitism. So, the argument here was that that there was a worldwide Jewish conspiracy, and that posed a threat. And again, the Hollywood film studios provided kind of an easy target for that ideology. As with other national cinemas, Hollywood films themselves already posed a real threat to the German film industry. For Nazi ideology, Hollywood offered a convenient shorthand combining a racialized anti-Semitism with this anti-globalization rhetoric. This is a picture of police outside a screening of the Universal film All Quiet on Western Front from 1930, and so this film was supposed to be kind of like a big budget, international blockbuster, and and sort of the premieres took place relatively simultaneously in the U.S. and Germany, and the police were there because of these protests that were taking place in Berlin in 1930 and Vienna later in 1931 at these premieres. And the protests alleged that the film All Quiet on the Western Front was part of the so-called Jewish plot to humiliate the German people. Joseph Goebbels organized the protests, releasing mice in theater, setting off tear gas, and having brown shirts shout "Jews out, Germany awake" during the screening. In April of 1933, the Nazi regime ordered German offices of Hollywood studios to discharge Jewish employees. Hollywood film studios were a target even before Nazi legislation began to sort of, I'd say in earnest, try to bar Jews from civic and public life in Germany. So this was so this announcement that from the New York Times stories went out a full week before the Nazi law barring Jews from civil service. Because the Hollywood studios relied on extensive distribution networks worldwide, they quickly learned of of orchestrated Nazi violence and forcible expropriation of their own and their affiliates' property. By late 1938, the head of the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association, Will Hayes, had received 100 pages of documented testimony following Kristallnacht. By 1939, the Nazis had forcibly seized offices of the United Artists, Vienna subsidiary. So, I mean, there's just a question of like, how was Hollywood responding to all this? And And here I think this concept of circuitous exchanges also becomes useful in that Hollywood. I would argue that Hollywood films reference the rise of Nazi anti-Semitism, not necessarily explicitly, but circuitously, and audiences knew how to interpret these kinds of elliptical references. So let me just kind of back up here and I guess offer some qualifications, or not qualifications, but some contextual information. As I hope I've made clear, the film studios really found themselves in caught in a kind of double bind. They made films too strident, too anti-Nazi, then that would only give credence to the canard that Jews controlled Hollywood. If the films, on the other hand, avoided too much current events, then Hollywood's many critics could accuse the industry of simply being out of touch, irrelevant, or tone deaf to the plight of European Jews. So again, how did these kinds of elliptical references take place? So I guess one important strategy here that Hollywood studios relied on genre films to convey topical meanings to audiences. And what are genre films? So genre films are these sort of categories of different kinds of films that provide standardized formulas for telling stories. And the idea with genres is that essentially each genre film kind of trains the audience, right? So audiences would know what to expect, and those formulas could also help streamline the censorship process, right? So it becomes a way of standardizing the texts, the films that Hollywood puts out. At the same time, genre films provided some degree of flexibility. So there could be some slight variations among the different elements for each film. So different stars, different settings, characters, and the like. But that flexibility still would allow enough of a new experience while preserving audience familiarity with the basic contours of the genre. So here, I think, referencing Nazi anti-Semitism kind of elliptically, alluding to it indirectly, really provided some of that variation across the various genres, even if the fundamental contours of the genres stayed the same. So what I'd like to do now is kind of give you a few examples of films. Probably many of you already know these films, but hopefully I can kind of try to present them in a new light. I also need to apologize in advance because I think the audio is a little bit low, so you might need to turn up your speakers if you're having a hard time hearing the dialogue. So the first film I want to talk about is Warner Brothers' 1937 biopic, The Life of Emile Zola, which is sort of masquerading as a great man biography of the French author, but really most of the film's narrative centered on Zola's involvement in the so-called Dreyfus affair. So as many people pointed out, no one in the film ever speaks the word Jew, and there's only really a single fleeting shot of the word throughout the entire film. So, but here's where I think I might offer like a little bit of a different analysis. So many people have said, well, that film's a cop-out. It didn't directly address anti-Semitism. But I would argue that the film didn't need to explain this to 1937 audiences, who would have at once recognized the correspondence between the globalized anti-Semitic scandal of 30 years earlier and the rise of racialized Nazi anti-Semitism of the 1930s. And so I just want to go ahead and play a brief clip that where this sort of brief shot of the word Jew appears. That's the only time that the film sort of explicitly references Dreyfus's identity.
I think that will be all, gentlemen.
Pardon me, General.
Yes?
This is most urgent.
Yeah. It's a Bordeaux.
Yes. A list of our secret documents.
I am sending you, what's this? Notes on the 120 millimeter gun you plan on covering troops. Changes in artillery formation. Madagascar expedition. New shooting manual for field artillery, very difficult to procure. I am about to leave for... This accounts for the leakage in Army information. How'd we get it?
The usual channel, sir. Our agent procured it at the German embassy.
Huh. Well, gentlemen, the man who wrote this is our traitor. Now, who is it?
He must be on the general staff, sir.
One of us?
Absurd.
Impossible. Well, let's have a look at this roster of staff officers. Record of officers. Aaron d'Aberville. It's not you, I suppose, d'Aberville, is it?
I'll swear it's not. Marvelous. It's like a confounded novel.
Deron, c'est de Bigny.
No.
Dreyfus.
You found something, Colonel?
I was just wondering about Esterhazy. Ferdinand Count Valsin Esterhazy. He's a foreigner.
A foreigner?
Yes. He's of Hungarian descent.
But his father was a general in the French army. Besides, Esterhazy's an infantry officer. The man who wrote that bordereau's a gunner.
Gunner. About this fellow here, Dreyfus, Alfred.
I wonder how he ever became a member of the General Staff.
That's our man.
Yeah, so okay, so you kind of you blink, you miss it, right? But again, I don't know that the film really had to do much more than what it did. And here, I think you have to really look at the publicity surrounding the film to understand that. Warner Brothers publicity for the film actively promoted this kind of this sort of correspondence between these two historical events, and did so to Jewish audiences, right? So what you're looking at, it's fairly common for all the studios that they would regularly prepare these stories for newspapers and magazines that would be sort of really easy for those outlets to kind of drop into their publications. And I think what's a little bit unique about this was that Warner Brothers was using the Jewish press to encourage politically and socially relevant readings of the film in both English and Yiddish. So this slide here shows what was going out to the English language Jewish papers. And you can see there's a testimonial from the editor of the American Hebrew, which was a large circulation Jewish magazine at the time. And you can see here the editor, Louis Rudenberg, it's sort of, again, actively making the connection here that we need to, look at this film and understand it in terms of like kind of a present international danger of racial and religious prejudice. And then on the other side of the sheet would be the stories that would just, again, be readily dropped into the Yiddish papers as well. So, clearly the publicity surrounding the film is encouraging and guiding a certain kind of interpretation of film that, really is sort of not contained within the film itself. It's more contextual. So I wanted to show another example, and this was from RKO's 1939 prestige horror film, The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
The German inventor Gutenberg calls it a printing press, Your Majesty. What is it?
Sorry, I was a little trigger happy on the slide advancement. And I think what's sort of interesting, this is from the beginning of the film, and what's interesting is how the opening of the film really sort of leverages both books as well as Roma people to try to establish a topicality and relevance to Nazi anti-Semitism. And I do have to warn you, film's a product of its time, so it does use the derogatory term for Roma, but hopefully that is, you can sort of put that in context given what's going on here.
What do you call this apparatus? The German inventor Gutenberg calls it a printing press, Your Majesty.
What is it for?
To print books, Your Majesty.
For whom?
For the people. They will learn to read when they can get books. I can print a volume like this one in a few weeks, and quite inexpensively.
Imagine, Frollo, a few weeks. When I ordered my prayer book, it took them years to copy it out and cost me a fortune. This is more beautiful than the printed book. Nevertheless, the printing press is a miracle.
A horrifying miracle.
Horrifying? This small press?
Small things have a way of overmastering the great. The Nile rat kills the crocodile. This small press can destroy a kingdom.
Oh, come, my High Justice. Don't exaggerate. What is that?
It is the first page of a new book, Your Majesty.
Let me see it. On the freedom of thought. Who wrote it?
Pierre Gringoire,
Gringoire? Who is he?
a French poet, Your Majesty.
A heretic, sir. To spread him is to communicate disease.
How do you know? It may be a great blessing to France if people can get books and learn to read. To me, it's a new form of expression of thought. Out there is the old form. All over France, in every city, there stand cathedrals like this one, triumphal monuments of the past. They tower over the homes of our people like mighty guardians, keeping alive the invincible faith of the Christian. Every arch, every column, every statue is a carved leaf out of our history, a book in stone, glorifying the spirit of France. The cathedrals are the handwriting of the past. The press is of our time. And I won't do anything to stop it, Frollo.
Sir, we must break the press and hang the printer, for between them they will destroy our old and holy order.
No, I'm not such a fool.
I, for my part, will protect France from these printed books as I will protect it from witches, sorcerers, and gypsies, the foreign race that is overrunning all of Europe.
Why do you stop us? Because no gypsies can enter Paris any longer without a permit. It's the new law.
If the others cannot too, why can't we?
They are Frenchmen. You're gypsies, foreigners.
Foreigners. You came yesterday, we come today.
Let them pass. It's Fool's Day. Fool's Day or not, we don't want these foreigners. Stop her, catch her!
Irene, Grandma, the hunchback of Notre Dame just crossed my path. Go home, quickly, and light the candle.
That won't help against Quasimodo. He's possessed. Yvonne, aren't you going to the festival to see the king?
So yes, the film we just saw was the RKO's 1939 prestige horror film, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and so the 1930s audiences would not have missed the oblique reference to Nazi book burnings that occur in this opening, and at the same time, a sort of tie-in to books, I think also marked a key strategy of the film industry to try to elevate the cultural value of its films by using works of great literature. Also, I don't know if you caught this, but the film is really promoting a kind of progressive view of religion, of literature, of popular culture, that the church can coexist with literature, and I think by extension, film can work to promote both the church and great books. I think it's a message that's maybe not lost on someone who recognizes the kind of racialized anti-Semitic attacks on the film industry as being sort of, again, supposedly run by Jews. In addition, it's clear that Roma people have become kind of a surrogate for European Jews in the film. And while the film does not depict Nazism, I think it does do a pretty, as much as film could at that time, maybe does a pretty good job of identifying the sort of ideology of Nazism that tied circulation and flows of cultural products and people to, say, like infectious diseases or vermin who can, kill larger animals. So the last film I want to present to you, I feel like I'm trotting out all the old chestnuts here, is Charles Chaplin's 1940 The Great Dictator. And I wanted to show this because I think it's as maybe the Hollywood film that is the exception that proved the rule here. So it was the first feature-length, big-budget Hollywood film to address Nazi anti-Semitism head-on. However, I think it's important to acknowledge that there were other films, notably short subjects, that had already satirized Nazism and Hitler, including the Three Stooges short almost a year earlier called You Nasty Spy. And I think also it's important to recognize Chaplin was able to do what he was able to do because he owned his own film studio and distribution company. He wrote, produced, directed, starred in, and wrote the music himself for the film. And I think it's not like the fact that Hollywood that Great Dictator was sort of taking on Hitler that wasn't necessarily invisible to publicity, but at least as important as that was the idea that this was the first film where Chaplin was going to speak, that publicity tried to highlight the fact that this was like a satirical comedy, but one in the tradition of Chaplin's other slapstick films. And I think it's also kind of interesting, just as a side note, to acknowledge that this was Chaplin's most commercially successful film. And kind of along those lines, I think the film, and hopefully the clip I'm about to show you, really illustrates this, that the film really follows familiar comedy formulas, including mistaken identities, Chaplin playing dual roles. In the scene I'm about to show you, Chaplin plays a Jewish barber who served in World War I, and after his service, he returns home with amnesia. So he's had amnesia for a while, and he's completely unaware of the rising anti-Semitism that has gripped his country. And in the scene, which I find kind of remarkably dark in some ways, he's about to essentially be lynched before unexpectedly meeting up with his old army buddy, who now serves as an officer in this authoritarian regime. So let's take a look at The Great Dictator.
Is this the man?
That's him.
Hail Hinkle.
Who's he?
Don't fool with me. I said Hail Hinkle.
All right.
Put out your hands.
Just a moment. We won't put him on here. Bring him outside.
Yes, come on, you. Come on.
Before we take you down, you'll finish this. Here. Go on. Paint that.
Hey, you!
Idea. Sure, that's it.
Wait a minute. Commander Schultz. Attention.
First in command.
Yes, sir.
What the? Second in command.
Yes, sir.
Oh, never mind. You.
Yes, sir.
What the devil goes on here? And who told you to hang people from lampposts?
No one, sir.
My orders were to keep these streets tidy. What was the trouble?
A Jew is attacking stormtroopers, sir.
Where is he?
There. Break ranks.
Oh, so there you are. Stand him up. Get up.
In terms of, I guess, kind of wrapping up, I wanted to end by asking how we can think of Hollywood and the Holocaust as a set of circuitous exchanges, given some of this information. So I think first, we need to think of film in terms of distinct yet overlapping components of producers, texts, and audiences. Second, I think we need to recognize that a set of specific technological, political, and cultural conditions all made Hollywood studios a target for racialized anti-Semitism and anti-globalist attacks. Third, Hollywood developed a set of complex elliptical strategies to navigate these conditions. Finally, one of these strategies involved the use of genres to negotiate multiple meanings through familiar narrative formulas. So again, I'd like to hear from you all in terms of what your thoughts are, what your takeaway is from this material. So again, thank you very, very much for your attention and patience with me as I fumbled through my presentation, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
A listener wants to know about the Confessions of a Nazi Spy, 1939. If you have anything to say about that film.
Right. So yeah. So that film was quite important. But what's interesting about that film, which really was kind of an expose of Nazi infiltration of the U.S. Of the U.S. itself, and I think really didn't kind of, again, wasn't as explicit in terms of engaging and addressing Nazi anti-Semitism as a film like The Great Dictator was. I think nonetheless, it's an important film, and even that film, which I think is fairly, I mean, today you might watch it and think that's a fairly mild indictment of anti-Semitism. Even that film brought controversy down on Warner Brothers and the Hollywood film industry for, I think, the reasons I mentioned before, that there was this sort of, it was very acceptable at the time to make allegations that Jews controlled Hollywood, and here's this anti-Nazi films that's coming out that's trying to expose this spy network. I should also mention, I mean, the film's based on a real trial that took place in the U.S., and a lot of times, just like with the Hunchback of Notre Dame, if there was a book involved, or there's a popular play, or in this case, like sort of actual events that took place, that's leverage for Hollywood. That's what allowed we're not allowed, but that's what kind of can help the studios make the argument that their public is interested in these things, and that there's a there's a benefit to making these films that would outweigh any of the controversy they would engender.
Thank you. There's a couple of questions coming in, but I'm gonna ask one of them first, I guess, for selfish reasons, because it kind of dovetails with a question that I have. Actually, there's some really good questions, but one a viewer wants to know what role Hollywood played in the propagation of anti-Jewish sentiments, and I was wondering the same thing, because you've talked about the impact of anti-Semitism from Europe, particularly Germany, on the standards of and even impact on the kinds of stories that are told. But you did mention at the beginning that Jews were able to enter the film industry because it was new and there, wasn't a precedence of a glass ceiling to break or something like that. But what about the general anti-Semitism that was, kind of homegrown, and that impact on the film industry?
Yeah, so I think and again, something like the Dearborn Independent, the magazine or newspaper cover that I showed is, I think, a pretty good indication of that. That it was really acceptable to speak freely about. Or I guess freely express anti-Semitic attitudes, not just toward Jews individually, but also toward the film industry itself. And so my argument was in part, not exclusively, but in part, the industry formed this trade organization, the Motion Picture Producers and Distributors Association, as a way to indirectly respond to those kinds of attacks on the film industry. In terms of Hollywood, in terms of Hollywood kind of promoting that anti-Semitism, I think the answer is kind of complicated. So there were films that I think used a lot of stereotypical Jewish characters, up through the 1920s. But I think it's also important to recognize that those films were meant for Jewish audiences, right? So there's this kind of shift that takes place in the 1920s and 30s that kind of coincides with the rise of sound technology, where as films are becoming more popular and as the film industry is maturing and as the sound technology is becoming more stable, that there's films are going out to wider populations. So whereas films, a lot of films might only be in the 1920s only be shown in urban theaters. By the 1930s, you're seeing a lot more theaters spring up, say in like more rural or suburban areas, and the audience is becoming more diverse. And so those kinds of Jewish stereotypes aren't necessarily going to appeal to audiences outside of New York and other metropolitan areas. I think if anything, one could make an argument that Jewish films really tried to avoid those kinds of specific references, whether it was to Jews or other kind of marginalized groups, really out of fear that they might alienate this kind of like growing mass public that wanted to see a very kind of standardized, plain vanilla, white world. And so I think that, really the industry just avoided controversy and tried to avoid being singled out, either in terms of identifying anti-Semitism, in terms of promoting anti-Semitism, in terms of featuring specifically identifiable Jewish characters.
Thank you. There's two questions that came in that are different but related in that trying to tie the presentation into current concerns. So I'm going to ask them both, and I guess you can either mush them together or just answer. So the first question is, what's your impression of how all of this resembles what is currently happening with films, books, and Broadway, current anti-Jewish sentiment, attacks, etc.? And I'm not sure if the person asking is, what's your impression of the impact of this on films, books, and Broadway, or how Broadway is representing. I'm not quite sure, but the other question is, what are your thoughts, and this is very relevant in today's environment, what are your thoughts about using these clips in university settings today, especially with the increase of anti-Semitism on college campuses? So
Yeah,
related.
these are great questions. Yeah, I mean, I think so. I think the glib answer is it's complex, right? You know, I mean, I think that there's a lot of interest in films, books, sort of uh, uh, plays, musicals that address anti-Semitism. And I know on our campus, for example, we had a really outstanding production of the musical Cabaret. So, I think people, I think people are really interested in, finding like serious entertainment that provides commentary on this issue. And again, I guess I would kind of fall back to the little model I put up at the beginning of my presentation, in the sense that you have some different parts of the chain. So you have producers, texts, and audiences, and one does really not determine the outcome of the other. So I think audiences are in some ways free to interpret and take away different kinds of meanings for all this cultural material. And I think it's just important to recognize that the fundamental role that popular culture plays, right? And when we encounter different moments of crisis that are occurring in culture, that a lot of times popular culture is kind of there to help make sense of what's going on in the world for us. Now, it doesn't always do it well, and sometimes it contributes to the problem. But I think what I'd say is what I think the value is in terms of popular culture is that it really is providing the space for people to kind of talk about, think about, analyze, reflect on what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think in terms of what's happening on college campuses and how to use this material in colleges, again, I would say not every college campus is equal to every other college campus, right? So, I'm on, I work at a regional public university in the Midwest, and I think that my biggest challenge on this campus is not kind of rampant anti-Semitism that's taking place. My biggest challenge, I don't mean to trivialize that, but my biggest challenge would be simply students' unfamiliarity with those clips, right? And unfamiliarity with like the history that provides a context for those clips. So I think it's important. I think, like, for example, I think educators really play an important role here, because we can help facilitate that process of students understanding the bigger picture. We can provide those spaces in our classrooms, that allow students some of that latitude and flexibility to begin seeing these cultural artifacts from different perspectives and different angles. And so, I guess this is my sort of full-throated endorsement, not just of the value of popular culture as a kind of vehicle to help people make sense of an otherwise confusing world, but also just an endorsement of the value of education to help bring about, and broaden understanding. So, and I don't want to get too big for my britches here, but maybe the point is to bring these clips to college campuses and try to facilitate a discussion, a larger discussion about what anti-Semitism is, what it was historically, how Hollywood failed or maybe did as well as it could in addressing things. I mean, I think all of this is it's really important for us to keep talking, even as the sort of landscape seems to become, more threatening with each passing day.
Thank you. And, I also, just to add to that, that's something that I've been thinking a lot recently myself about students' unfamiliarity with the history of anti-Semitism and the history of Jews in general in the United States, which, yeah, it's a huge knowledge gap that we need to fill. If we have time there were two other questions that I'm going to collapse, if that's okay. I know we're at 1 o'clock, but maybe if we could just have a couple of minutes extra. The first question is, are there other examples of comedy genre films that also use satire to critique anti-Semitism or those in power? And I guess the answer is yes. And the other question is, yeah, the short answer. Can you address the reaction from Hollywood studios when Leni Riefenstahl asked for distribution of her film Olympia?
Yeah, so I'm not I guess I'm not too knowledgeable about the production history of Olympia. I think in terms of the question about comedy genre films, I mean, I think there's a long tradition within Hollywood of what Sandra Gilman and others have called the anti-fascist comedy, right? And so I think I mentioned the Three Stooges film, You Nasty Spy. There was another follow-up to that film because the first one was so popular. And yeah, I mean, in some ways, I think you could go back to like even the Marx Brothers Duck Soup of 1933, which is kind of just satirizing authoritarian governments, not Nazism specifically. But there's also To Be or Not to Be, and again, I mean, not all of them, but certainly a lot of those comedies, all involve mistaken identity, sort of dual roles. And so I think there's something going on there in terms of, that's how Hollywood film kind of, that was like the dominant way in which Hollywood film tried to deal with Nazism and Nazi anti-Semitism, up until the post-war era. In terms of Riefenstahl's film, I mean, I think the short answer is it's really complicated in terms of how Hollywood kind of responded to Riefenstahl in general. So Riefenstahl came to visit Hollywood in the 1930s, I think at the invitation of some of the studios, but there was widespread protest against her visit amongst sort of various various workers in at the Hollywood studios themselves. And I mean, Riefenstahl never really got the sort of grand welcome that she expected. Just sort of funny. So yeah, I mean, I think that there were some in Hollywood who really admired her films, and certainly the films were sort of important advances in film technique, but but again, it's like you have to sort of recognize advances of film technique in the service of what, right? I mean, they're also being made in the service of an anti-Semitic authoritarian regime, and so I think again I think their reaction from Hollywood is kind of bimodal in the sense that people really admired her films, but there are also many people within Hollywood who recognized the origins of the film and what resources came to bear that produced those films. So I think that's probably as good a place as any to land here. I just wanted to again say thank you all for your attention. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to you, and thank you, Laura and Julie, for a really great experience.
Steve, it's tremendous. We have collaborated on many projects together, and I think that one of the things I always really appreciate, and I know you've mentioned this a few times, is the words complicated or complex. And I think there is such nuance to this history and also how it's playing out in our society right now. And I remember when you were reviewing one of the KHC's older exhibitions specifically on this topic, you spoke about how there were so many assumptions that at the time were grounded in a lot of facts, but have since been disproven. And one of the challenges of handing out an older catalog to our students would be they might replicate some of those stereotypes. And I remember this being a real big issue a few years ago when there was anti-Semitic videos being circulated by Kanye West and Kyrie Irving, and it kind of brought Jews and anti-Semitism and control of Hollywood to the forefront. Julia, would you like to add any closing remarks?
I don't have an eloquent closing remark except for thank you. It was, I wish we had, all afternoon to discuss. Actually, I wish I could take a class with you. And I am thinking about incorporating some of your clips into my own sociology of arts class, because again, I think first of all, the importance of technology and how technology and particular socio-historical circumstances kind of meld together and create these create these products. So that's really interesting. And just the complex ways, again, that historical factors act on even something like Hollywood that we think of as sort of in control of its own outcomes in a certain kind of way. But just seeing how it adapts and what you were saying about how understanding that popular culture is an important tool for making sense of the problems in the world, but at the same time, the problems of the world appear in popular culture, and learning how to read it is just as important as understanding that it's important.
I feel like that's the takeaway for the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you, Steve. It's been a pleasure. And thank you for to everyone who logged in today. We're really grateful for all your support, and we hope you stay safe and be well. Thanks, everyone.